I started attending the Vineyard Church Peoria early in 2021 and accepted the position of the worship leader here in January of 2022. So I've had the privilege of being on a different microphone since then, but this is my first time in this space, so I appreciate your graciousness. Some random facts about me that you may or may not know. I was actually born and raised in Indiana. I attended ISU, the real ISU, that would be Indiana State University, which existed before the ISU that Illinois people, whatever. I graduated from Indiana State with a music degree and a piano pedagogy certificate, which just means that I have gone through training to be a piano teacher. I married my college sweetheart, actually the weekend before I walked in commencement, and we celebrated 24 years of marriage this past April. We have 2 beautiful children. You've probably seen them around. So this is my beautiful family, my husband, Mike. It all sounds pretty perfect, right? Like I can't complain. I have a pretty amazing group of people that I call family. But there was one point for quite a long time that there was a situation that I desperately wanted to leave. It wasn't that one. Those guys, they're wonderful. I wouldn't trade them even on our hardest days, even on the days where I just want to as she's making faces at me, no, I wouldn't trade them. That's not the situation that I wanted out of. But there was another one. And it was rough, and I really wanted out. I mean, maybe you've been there in a situation where it was uncomfortable. Maybe an uncomfortable dinner with family or a difficult job situation. Maybe you have had a hard relationship with a boss. Or for parents, you've been in a long line at a theme park on a hot day with young children and you just want out, right? The examples on this side of the kingdom of situations where you might have prayed a similar prayer are endless. They're endless. For me, in this particular situation, I begged and I pleaded with God to be released. I spent hours in prayer over it. I cried countless tears of anger and hurt and frustration. Have you been there? Unhappy and confused, uncertain about the course ahead of you? I was there. And I had to make a choice. Do I trust God or do I trust my feelings? So, a couple of weeks ago, we left Paul just after a jailbreak in Acts 16. Okay, maybe you remember there was the whole earthquake and all of that. Well, from there, we're going to jump forward. So I'm going to take us through just a brief overview of how we get to Acts 27, which is where we will land today. So from that moment of that jailbreak, Paul traveled all over. He went to Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth, Ephesus, Macedonia, Greece. He went all over, and everywhere he went, God had paved the way for him. And Paul stepped into where God was already working. As Matthew mentioned a couple of weeks ago, God is already working. He's working ahead of us, and we get to step into that. And that's exactly what Paul was doing as he was making all of these journeys. But eventually, Paul made his way back to Jerusalem, and he was once again arrested. And the Jews there plotted to kill him. They were done with him. They wanted him gone. But the authorities in charge of protecting him kept him safe until his case could be heard. Ultimately, as his case was being heard by various people, Paul made it known that he is a Roman citizen, and how dare you treat a Roman citizen this way? He had been beaten. It was not good. It was not good. And eventually he appealed to Caesar, which meant that he had to take a trip to Rome. He's in Jerusalem. They have to take him to Rome so that he can plead his case before Caesar. So that brings us to Acts 27, which is where we're going to pick up. Paul is under the guard of a centurion and his soldiers, and he's on a cargo ship headed for Rome. They've been caught in a terrible storm, and it seems like they are going down. They're lost, they're hopeless, and they have no clue what the future holds for them. So let's pick up the story in Acts 27. It says, on the 14th night, adrift somewhere on the Adriatic Sea, at about midnight, the sailors sensed that we were approaching land. Sounding, which means they were checking how deep the water is, sounding, they measured a depth of 120 feet, and shortly after that, 90 feet. Afraid that we were about to run aground, they threw out 4 anchors and prayed for daylight. Some of the soldiers tried to jump ship. They let down the lifeboat, pretending they were going to set out more anchors from the bow. Paul saw through their guise and told the centurion and his soldiers, if these sailors don't stay with the ship, we are all going down. So the centurion and the sailors and the soldiers had to make a choice. Do they trust God, or do they trust their feelings? Who's driving this boat? How do you even begin to find your way through a choice like that? Well, first you have to learn to distinguish God's voice. So how does God speak to you? So there are various examples throughout Scripture of ways that God might speak. In 1 Kings 19, he speaks to Elijah, not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a gentle and quiet whisper. But then in Job 38, God speaks to Job from the eye of a violent storm. In Genesis 28, God spoke to Jacob in a dream. This was the promise of Jacob's descendants. In Acts 10, we studied this a few weeks ago. God spoke to Peter through a vision with the blanket with all kinds of food. You remember that? He can even use those who haven't accepted Christ yet. Just like in Acts 16 with the little slave girl who was prophesying God, but she didn't even know what she was saying. So how does God speak to you? For a very long time, God spoke to me with lightning. So, another fun fact about me, I am a weather nerd. I love weather. This is true, I follow no less than 6 weather sources on Facebook. I have 2 weather apps on my phone, plus a subscription weather service. I am fascinated by weather. I love it. I just think it's amazing. My husband and I even actually bought each other a weather station for Christmas this last year, and it's set up in our side yard. So at any point, I can tell you the weather at my house. I can tell you how much rain we've had, how windy it is, how much sunlight we're getting. I love it. It's just amazing to me. My favorite, though, is probably a good thunderstorm. I've actually been known to sit on the floor on a beanbag in front of our sliding glass doors, staring up at the sky, watching lightning like a kid. It cracks my children up. They think I'm ridiculous, and that's okay. I'm okay with that because it's beautiful. I love it. The lightning, the thunder, the rain. I'm even fascinated by the more destructive storms that can even, sadly, be deadly, like these tornadoes that we've been watching, these outbreaks that we've had. As devastating as they are, there's something fascinating about them to me. The same God who controls the wind and the weather created me. He loves me. He sacrificed his son for me, the same God. And it gets me. Every time, it just gets me. For a period of probably about 10 years, like I said, God spoke to me through lightning. In the middle of that situation where I wanted out, where I felt discouraged and unseen and insignificant, where I felt important and a necessary nuisance who was barely tolerated, I wanted out. Remember that? As hard as I had prayed, God had not released me from that assignment. Despite my pleas, he had told me to stay put. And in one moment of particular upset, as I pulled up to the building with begrudging obedience, has anybody ever been there? Begrudging obedience to show up yet again. There were storm clouds brewing. just before I got out of my car, I witnessed the most beautiful, delicate, intricate strike of lightning in the clouds over the building. And in that instant, God reminded me that he was with me, that he promises to never leave me or forsake me, that he saw me and he knew how unhappy I was, but that he had a plan. And he sent me that display of his love and his encouragement to stay the course. He spoke to me, and I had to make a choice. I had to decide whether to give God my yes or to follow my own feelings. For me, I had to decide whether to stay in that situation that God was telling me that he wanted me to stay, or if I was going to get the heck out of Dodge, which is what I really wanted to do. So back in Acts, Paul and the centurion and these soldiers and sailors, all of those on the ship, they had to make the same kind of a decision a couple of times, actually. We already talked about the second one where they had been lost at sea for 2 weeks. They seemed like they were rapidly nearing land. They were afraid they were going to run aground. So the sailors, were like, we're out of here. And Paul gave the prophecy that if these sailors don't stay with the ship, we're all going down. So do they stay in the boat or do they jump ship? Before we answer that, let's look at how they got to that point in the first place. How did they get in that situation? So remember, Paul was on his way to Rome for a hearing with Caesar. So let's pick up the story a little further back in Acts 27, verse 4. Out to sea again, we sailed north under the protection of the northeast shore of Cyprus because winds out of the west were against us. And then along the coast westward to the port of Myra. There the centurion found an Egyptian ship headed for Italy and transferred us on board. We ran into bad weather and found it impossible to stay on course. After much difficulty, we finally made it to the southern coast of the island of Crete and docked at Good Harbor, appropriate name. By this time, we had lost a lot of time. We had passed the autumn equinox, so it would be stormy weather from now on through the winter, too dangerous for sailing. Paul warned, I see only disaster ahead for cargo and ship, to say nothing of our lives, if we put out to sea now. But it was not the best harbor for staying the winter. Phoenix, a few miles further on, was more suitable. So they were stuck for the winter. Good Harbor, which is also translated as Fair Haven, which is where they landed, was exposed to the elements. There was no real shelter from the wind and the storms that were coming because they were past the autumn equinox. They were into the winter stormy season. It was a hard place to spend those winter months. Phoenix, which was the next town, was protected from the winds. It was surrounded by mountains, and it was a much more comfortable place to spend the next few months. But it required sailing around the point of Crete, which would expose the ship to some wind that they hadn't yet experienced. So they heard God speak through Paul, and he said, stay put. But they also knew that it would be a hard place to stay for the winter. And Paul had delivered another prophecy, right? It's disaster if we leave. Danger to the ship and to our lives. Paul, who was familiar with God's voice, said, we need to stay here. The sailors, who were not familiar with God's voice, but who knew the weather and knew the seas, said, this is not the right place to stay. We need to get to the next port. And it was up to the centurion, who spoke with the authority of Caesar, to make that decision. Do you give God your yes? Do you follow your own wisdom, your own feelings? Acts 27:11 says, the centurion set Paul's warning aside and let the ship captain and the ship owner talk him into trying for the next harbor. They decided to go. How do you think that turned out? Well, if we pick up again in 13, when a gentle southerly breeze came up, They weighed anchor, thinking it would be smooth sailing, but they were no sooner out to sea than a gale-force wind, the infamous nor'easter, struck. They lost all control of the ship. It was a cork in the storm. If we jump to verse 18, it says, "Next day, out on the high seas again and badly damaged now by the storm, we dumped the cargo overboard. The third day, the sailors lightened the ship further by throwing off all the tackle and provisions. It had been many days since we had seen either sun or stars. Wind and waves were battering us unmercifully, and we lost all hope of rescue." This looks pretty bad, right? They blew it. The centurion chose to trust the knowledge of the sailors over Paul's relationship with God, and they ended up in dire circumstances. Now, don't mishear me. Not all circumstances come about, not all difficult circumstances come about because we mishear God or we disobey him. Sometimes they do, though. And I'd be willing to bet that we can each see a correlation between ignoring God's voice in our lives and landing ourselves in some difficult places. That's what I'm talking about here. I'm sure these sailors recognized their own folly, but just in case they didn't, Paul made it abundantly clear. In verse 21, he says, with our appetite for both food and life gone, Paul took his place in our midst and said, "Friends, you really should have listened to me back in Crete. We could have avoided all this trouble and trial." Don't you love an "I told you so" guy? Guys, you should have listened to me. I told you. Now look at this mess we're in because you messed up. But here's the thing. We have to learn how to turn back to God when we blow it. And we all blow it sometimes, right? How did the centurion and his soldiers, the captain and the sailors, blow it? Well, they didn't listen. They didn't listen to Paul. They didn't listen to God's voice through Paul. And what did their disobedience to God's word cost them? Well, so far, the ship is badly damaged. All the cargo, tackle, and provisions are gone. They're hopeless and helpless in the middle of this storm. Eventually, we will learn that the entire ship is lost. That's a pretty hefty price to pay. But our God is so gracious that he doesn't leave them there. Though they had given up, he hadn't given up on them. Verse 22, Paul continues after his "I told you so." He says, "I can assure you that there'll not be a single drowning among us." Now, I'm going to stop you for a second. You're in the middle of this storm. You have no hope. You think you're going to run aground. There's not going to be a single drowning among us. Although I can't say as much for the ship. The ship itself is doomed. I just love Paul. Last night, God's angel stood at my side, an angel of this God I serve, saying to me, "Don't give up, Paul. You're going to stand before Caesar yet, and everyone sailing with you is also going to make it. So, dear friends, take heart. I believe God will do exactly what he told me. But we're going to shipwreck on some island or other." Doesn't Paul just have a way of speaking into difficult circumstances that makes it so easy to accept? The people on this ship have been given another chance to hear God's voice and give him their yes. So let's go back to where we started this morning. Acts 27, verses 27 through 32. On the 14th night, adrift somewhere on the Adriatic Sea at about midnight, the sailors sensed that we were approaching land. Sounding, they measured the depth of 120 feet, and shortly after that, 90 feet. Afraid that we were about to run aground, they threw out 4 anchors and prayed for daylight. Some of the sailors tried to jump ship. They let down the lifeboat, pretending they were going to set out more anchors from the bow. Paul saw through their guise and told the centurion and his soldiers, "If these sailors don't stay with the ship, we're all going down." So the soldiers cut the lines to the lifeboat and let it drift off. They learned from their earlier experience to heed the voice of God. delivered through Paul. And they turned back to him. Their earlier refusal of God's wisdom, their lack of yes to him, their choosing to follow their own feelings and thoughts and knowledge led to some really harsh consequences. The loss of pretty much everything with their very lives at stake. Yet God was true to his word, even when he was hard to trust. The remainder of chapter 27 tells us that all 276 of the people on board that ship made it safely to shore, just as God had promised to Paul. As unlikely as that might seem. The ship, total loss. Just as Paul had prophesied, God was true to his word. And they could have ignored Paul's words again. They could have disregarded the message that Paul received from the angel, but they chose to give God their yes. They chose to trust him over their own ideas. They turned to him even after they blew it the first time. And it turned out much better. They got safely to shore. So this morning, I want to encourage you to trust God to steer your ship. In my own situation, where God spoke to me through the lightning, I made the decision to give him my yes. It was not the easy decision. It was not the decision that I wanted to make. But I have seen his blessing out of that decision, out of that obedience to him in countless ways. It's a big reason why I'm even standing here right now, today. Trusting God to steer the ship doesn't mean that you won't encounter storms. In fact, sometimes he steers us straight into them. But what it does mean is that we can rest in the promise that he's guiding us through that storm, that he's already ahead of us, preparing the way, lining up encounters with people who need to see the hope that we have, even in the middle of that storm. So, my friends, I encourage you to let God steer your ship.